Okay, hello everyone. This is Professor Lovell, and today we are going to talk about intersectionality and some various feminist critiques to the conceptions of power that we've been learning about already. You've had some hint of this in the week when we talked about Why Am I Other? So for example, the statements by Simone de Beauvoir and the others in that week all talked about this idea of being othered. Today, we are going to give some names to theories of oppression that kind of explain that process, as well as providing new ways of thinking about power that we haven't yet talked about. So let's review just really quick previous things that we've looked on power. The classical theorists, we talked a lot about Marx and class struggles. Whether or not someone owns the means of production will determine whether or not they have power, specifically in capitalism. For Weber, we discussed how he sees power as influencing others, and domination specifically is what he defined as the probability that specific commands will be obeyed. Du Bois took what Marx had in terms of class struggles and inserted racial projects and how race is used in these class struggles to divide the races. And these are all different ways they conceptualize power in society and whether an individual holds power. More contemporarily, we have Bourdieu, who was looking at power in terms of fields. And so he was looking very, a power would depend on the field, right? And whether or not you had a certain amount of capital and whether or not that capital was able to be used in that field. So if you had a lot of symbolic capital, but you wanted to be in business, you wouldn't have a lot of power in business. Similarly, if you have a lot of economic capital, but you wanted to, define science, you probably won't have a lot of power in that specific field. Bauman talks about power as the ability to weaponize modern instruments, and he specifically is looking at bureaucracy. And so he talked about how bureaucracy was a powerful tool, but when you tie it in with someone who wants to cleanse the world of specific people, then you have a pretty terrible situation, genocide. Foucault specifically, he's probably the main person who actually looks at power itself of the people that we've read so far. He defines power as these multiple force relations operating in a lot of different ways. And then we learned about 3 different ways he talks about power. First, power knowledge. Second, biopower. And third, disciplinary power. Okay. Return to last week's discussion if you're not quite familiar with, or those terms are still struggle for you. The power of intersecting oppressions is one of the easiest ways to link all of the theorists that we're going to read about today. I suspect that the first 3 will be the most readable and the most that people in the class will identify with and be able to relate to. So I'm interested to see what y'all's responses are to this week's reading. Minha and Spivak are a little more difficult. Spivak is extremely difficult. So if you are struggling with Spivak, feel free to set that one aside, watch this lecture, and look up summaries online. It is notoriously difficult, even for people who have had a PhD for 20 years, to get through and kind of understand exactly what she's talking about. She references a different philosopher almost every other sentence, and you have to have done a lot of reading to really catch all of her nuances. So hopefully this lecture will help distill it into something more manageable. So let's start with the first three. And so kind of broadly, we can define these three as operating within Black or Afrocentric feminism. Patricia Collins uses Afrocentric feminism. The other two, Audre Lorde and Kimberly Crenshaw, often use Black feminism. Lorde also in her writings deals a lot more with religion. And so she often is described as a womanist, and womanism is often, labeled as a theological Black feminism. So introducing that religious aspect into it as well. So Patricia Hill Collins, kind of to give you a look at who she is still around. She is still lecturing. She is an emeritus professor at the moment, meaning she has given up her full-time position, but she is, I think she still does classes every so often. She still works with students, and she does a lot of writing and lecturing and whatnot. She was the first African-American woman to be president of the American Sociological Association, and she's really well known for her work in the intersections of race, gender, and class. I've put up a couple of her books. What we are reading today is coming from the book that put her on the national scene, which is Black Feminist Thought. Students in my gender and sexualities class will read a chapter from her Black Sexual Politics, where she talks about the intersection of race, gender, class, and sexual orientation. And then she also has some really interesting ones. Here is From Black Power to Hip Hop, and kind of looking at the cultural politics of the civil rights era and Black Power. And just a really phenomenal researcher, and has really revolutionized a lot of what sociology looks at. And she is the only sociologist that we will be looking at today. The rest are in widely different fields, so it's going to be an interesting week to read. So she sets up the excerpt by just talking about how Western worldviews have traditionally objectified African-American women and recast their experiences simply to serve the interests of those white elite men. And she argues that we need to place Black women's experiences at the center of analysis. And when we do that, it demonstrates this system of oppression, this interlocking systems of oppression, because we're able to see better the power relations in society. When you are approaching understanding the social world from a privileged perspective, you often don't see or experience the power relations that are going on. And so she argues that if we center Black women, and in the US, that is often understood as one of the most marginalized identities, that from that standpoint, you can see and understand in a much clearer way the interlocking systems of oppression. And she calls this the matrix of domination. And matrix of domination is referring to a very wide, like a very macro societal level system, okay, or structure. And she says, previous work often starts with, especially in feminist research, will start with gender, and maybe they'll add in another variable. So how does age affect gender? Or how does sexual orientation affect gender? How does race affect gender? And she's saying that Black feminism sees this all as one whole structure of domination. And so she says that previous feminism was you add in an ingredient and stir the pot to gender, and that's how they were doing their analysis. And she's saying, no, these are all interlocking. And it's important to understand how each individual system needs the other systems of oppression to function. They cannot operate on their own. So without dismantling, or in order to dismantle racism, you also have to dismantle sexism, classism, ageism, right? You have to go down the lines because they're all interconnected and feed off of each other. So the matrix of domination is full of systems or axes of oppression. And we've previously named these already: sexuality, race, class, and I'll show you after we get to Crenshaw one way of looking at this. It is built upon a politic of domination. And she's pulling this from Bell Hooks, also a phenomenal social theorist and writer. So the politic of domination is the cultural belief of who is superior and who is inferior. Okay, and this is going to also be interlocking and intersecting depending on the actual system. But there is generally in society a politic of domination of who is better, who is more worthy. The matrix of domination as a theory rejects any idea that there is a single identity or position that takes primacy. So previous sociological work, I'm sorry, I have something in my esophagus. Previous sociological work, even since like the 1940s, argued that there is usually a single identity that takes over, and that is the most important or interactive identity. And usually people or sociologists would argue that identity is often a marginalized identity. So you often identify most with the identity that is most at odds with the surrounding culture. So in a very patriarchal system, you would women would identify more with gender than men, and men would identify with some other identity in which they are seen as a minority. The matrix of domination rejects that notion and says that's absurd. There's no way to distinguish my gender from my race, from my sexual orientation. They all bleed into each other. They're all part of each other. And so to analyze the matrix of domination, she says that it operates at three levels: the personal biography, a group or community, and then systemic or social institutions. And that similarly to Foucault, the matrix of domination defines and describes the experiences of oppression as well as the resistance to oppression. So it is all encompassing within this matrix of domination. So from the level of the personal biography, she talks a little bit about how social ties are both empowering and potentially confining, but she's not saying they're both at the same time. And this is different from Foucault, who argues that, who says any relation, any force relation is simultaneously subjectifying, meaning providing, and objectifying, restraining. And that's how we talked about power knowledge, but even in terms of the force relation, each force relation has power and resistance at the same time. She's saying social ties can be empowering, they can be confining, they can be both empowering and confining, but they don't have to be there simultaneously. And she's saying the individual consciousness is the site of where new knowledges occur, and so where change can begin. But this is also the site where the dominant oppressive force is trying to affect, right? They're trying to change your mind and trying to make you adopt the dominant ways of thinking so that you're more docile, so that you're more passive, so that you're not resistant to the overarching structure. Yet this is also where we have our individual resistance. On the second level is cultural community, and she notes, occupy several different cultural contexts, right? Me personally, for example, I have my cultural context with my family. I have a connection to my religion. I have a connection to this school as a professor. I have a connection to Northwestern as a grad student. I have a connection to Chicago, right? So I live in a bunch of different overlapping cultural contexts. And because of that, these overlaps help spark and spread new knowledge, because each cultural context brings with it some new kinds of knowledge, some different ways of thinking about the world. So she argues that the most stable cultural context will have a history that you can identify, a geography, and some kind of social institution. And we'll talk about social institutions next. And it's at the cultural level where there is competition between subjugated knowledges, which are knowledges of people who are in minority positions, and dominant knowledges, which are the kinds of knowledge and beliefs that are held by the powerful people in society. And she gives a couple examples, and I'm going to read from her excerpt. She says, adhering to externally derived standards of beauty, meaning, and this is the dominant knowledges, externally derived standards of beauty, leads many African American women to dislike their skin color or hair texture. Similarly, internalizing Eurocentric gender ideology leads some Black men to abuse Black women. These are cases of the successful infusion of the dominant group's specialized thought into the everyday cultural context of African Americans. So she's giving two examples of how dominant culture of patriarchy, of gender ideology, of standards of beauty affect the African American culture. And then she says, but the longstanding existence of Black women's culture of resistance, as expressed through Black women's relationships with one another, the Black women's blues tradition, and the voices of contemporary African American writers, all attest to the difficulty of eliminating the cultural context as a fundamental site of resistance. So she's saying that at the cultural level, you see all these patterns of domination coming in, but you also see these patterns of resistance pushing back, right? Music, African American women writers, poets, filmmakers, right? All of these things that continue to resist against the dominant Eurocentric culture. So the third level of domination that she brings out is the structural, or this is the social institutions. So your common examples of institutions are schools, churches, the media, and we can go on and on. And institutions are exposing groups and individuals to the dominant viewpoint and worldview, right? So it's through schools that you learn how the dominant culture believes in race, how it believes in the history of the nation, how it believes in gender, right? So it's through institutions that we are taught these ideologies. And she notes that they provide benefits, but also consequences, that at these institutions, you're often learning how to read. You're often gaining some skills that are necessary for a group's empowerment, but at the same time, to be a part of these institutions requires docility and passivity. So you have to accept the oppressive nature of institutions in order to gain the skills and literacy. Now, she argues that empowerment and resistance comes first in recognizing that each individual operates in multiple dominant groups and multiple subordinate groups. By recognizing that there is this matrix of domination in which we are all situated, there are very few people who are only in subordinate groups, and very few people who are only in dominant groups, right? So even in the US, she talks about how while Black women are often seen as one of the most marginalized groups in the US, Black women in poverty especially, you might think, well, Black women in poverty in the US are in the US, which is a dominant group in the world, right? So it is membership in a dominant group that other people outside of the US cannot claim. So the first thing we need to do is recognize that every individual is lying in between and dominant groups and subordinate groups. She argues that we need to understand our own biography and connect it to the larger social relations. If you have been in my contemporary social issues class, you will remember reading C. Wright Mills, who she quotes, and this is where it comes from, this idea of understanding one's own life and how it is connecting to shifts in the culture, shifts in the structures. And so she argues that with all of these differences, in recognizing that people live in various cultural contexts, that people occupy space in dominant and subordinate groups, that we need to have a dialectic in order to gain proper knowledge. A dialectic means discussion, and learning from each other is the best way to go forward in terms of resisting the matrix of domination. Next is Kimberly Crenshaw. I am not sure actually if you pronounce it Kimberly or Kimberly, so I'm sorry, I should have looked that up. She is a legal scholar, got her JD from Harvard, and is now a professor of law at UCLA. She is one of the founders of critical race theory. That she started a working group at UCLA called Critical Race Theory, and she was actually part of Anita Hill's legal team when Anita Hill was called to testify about Clarence Thomas's sexual abuse. She is known for really coining and popularizing the term intersectionality, which has gained very wide usage today. She's very active in civil rights and constitutional law, and she's really especially looking at race, gender, and law and how they intersect. So I put in a couple of things that she's been working on. She helped write a report on the discrimination and policing of Black girls in school. So the first little box there is Black Girls Matter, pushed out, over-policed, and underprotected. She runs a podcast, which I highly recommend, called Intersectionality Matters. And then she is currently publishing a book called The Racetrack, Understanding and Challenging Structural Racism. I'm not sure if that has come out yet or not. But still active today, still a speaker, still a writer, still a professor. So how does she talks about intersectionality, and I wanted to first clarify what the difference between matrix of domination and intersectionality are. So remember, the matrix of domination is explaining this overall context of intersecting and competing systems of oppression, whereas intersectionality is describing the consequences of the interaction between two or more axes of subordination. So I put together this graphic, and I hope it helps explain what is going on. Each of these spheres represents a different axis of oppression or system of oppression, okay? So for example, gender norms have different oppressive elements to it. So gender is a system of oppression: race, religion, nationality, disability, class. Altogether, these are the matrix of domination. Individually, they are a system of domination, right? So nationality is itself a system of domination. Altogether, these are the matrix of domination. When we put a person and we locate a person within this matrix of domination, that is where intersectionality comes in, to evaluate the consequences of all those intersecting systems of oppression, Okay, so we look at someone's intersectional positionality. So this person, we would be looking at the intersections of sexual orientation, gender, religion, and race, because those are the spaces they occupy. In reality, most of us occupy to some extent all of these, right? So personally, I am a citizen of the US. That means I have a specific location in the system of domination for nationality. I am an able-bodied person, so that puts me somewhere within disability. I am a member of a social class. I have education, right? So we are all in all of these spaces. And when we want to look at intersectionality, we want to be able to look at how they overlap and what that means. What are the consequences for that intersection? So Crenshaw argues that intersectionality is describing something more than compound discrimination, multiple burdens, additive oppression, double discrimination. She's saying something happens more than that. It's not just that, oh, I am not a Black woman, so we need to think about my race and gender. She's saying, no, the intersection of race and gender does something else that's more than just race and gender. So these are what intersectionality is. So structural and dynamic consequences of interacting axes of subordination. Multiple discriminatory systems, when they intersect, create background inequalities. And it helps, intersectionality helps us like identify policies and how these flow along the axis and how they disrupt other axes of oppression. And I'm going to give a case study that she used to develop the term intersectionality. This was a Supreme Court case. I don't know how to say that first name, de Graffenried versus General Motors. In it, 4 Black women were arguing that they were compoundly discriminated against in employment because they were both Black and female. So because of both gender and race. This sounds something like intersectionality. What happened was the Supreme Court decided to evaluate it first to see if there was racial discrimination and then to see if there was sex discrimination. So they, instead of looking at this compounding effect, they decided to look at them separately. And the Supreme Court argued that because Black men were employed in the factories of General Motors, there was no racial discrimination because Black individuals were employed by that company. There were also white women employed in the office, so there couldn't be gender discrimination, right? Because women were employed. And so the court's saying you can't say that you are discriminated against when there are both women and men and Black people in this organization. And so they dismissed the argument. And what Crenshaw is saying that the Supreme Court fundamentally misunderstood what it means to be at the axis or at the intersection of 2 systems of discrimination. So because they were Black women, Black individuals weren't being employed within the office because that was seen as more upper class, that was seen as, you know, more of a white person's job at the time. So Black individuals weren't in the office, so the Black women couldn't get hired there. The factories were understood as male work, so only men were being hired there. And so because they weren't fitting either of these, you know, areas within the company, they were completely excluded. And the Supreme Court missed that the intersection of race and gender caused an additional burden upon Black women seeking employment. Okay. When Crenshaw was part of the legal team for Anita Hill, she talked about something similar where a lot of Black individuals were criticizing Anita Hill for saying, why are you trying to tear down Clarence Thomas, who will be, the bastion of Blackness in the Supreme Court? We want another Black person on the Supreme Court. Whereas white women were applauding Anita Hill, saying, finally, a Black woman who's standing up to the abuse of men, right? And so white women looked at her as a woman, Black men or Black people looked at her as Black, but neither side understood the problem that existed because she lived at the intersection of being both Black and female. Okay, so that's the idea of intersectionality, is that where you occupy your social position within the matrix of domination, the intersection of all of those systems at your position create a really unique way of oppression and your need to navigate the social world. Okay. So the third Black feminist that we read this week is Audre Lorde. She was a librarian. She described herself as a Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet. And she is known for theories and actions on liberation of almost any kind of injustice you can think about. Because she was a poet and an essayist, I don't know if she ever wrote a full book. Most of these works are compilations of essays. The most famous one is probably Sister Outsider, but I also put in Your Silence Will Not Protect You and The Black Unicorn. So let's see what Audre Lorde is telling us. One of the most famous quotes in Black feminism is, you cannot use the master's tools, meaning you can't resist oppression by using the same techniques that oppressors use. And so she identifies some of the master's tools and what we need to do differently. So the first is independency. And she argues that in Western white capitalism, we really stress that you should be independent, that you shouldn't rely on people, that you shouldn't, that you should be able to do things on your own. And she argues, no, we should be interdependent. We should be working with each other and relying on each other, because that strengthens the community, that helps us all grow together and resist together. The second master's tool is to simply tolerate difference, right? To allow it to exist. Which she argues, no, we need to actually celebrate. We need to embrace differences, and we need to focus on those differences, because it is through difference that we interact and create new ideas and visions for the future. Third, she says the master's tools are to divide and conquer. And she says, no, we need to define and empower, define what our differences are and empower people to live them. So here is a quote from her essay. Within the interdependence of mutual differences lies that security which enables us to descend into the chaos of knowledge and return with true visions of our future. Difference is that raw and powerful connection from which our personal power is forged. So she really values the idea of each of us is unique, brings something to the table, and understanding our differences can empower us to help create a better future with the community. The last master tool that she identifies in this essay is she talks about how frustrating and diverting it is. And by diverting, I mean diverting attention, not as in like it's diverting and fun, is when people in power make those who are oppressed educate the people in power. So for example, saying, hi, I would love to learn more about Black feminism. Can you explain it to me? Or I really don't understand the experience of Black people in the world. Can you tell me about yours? And what Audre Lorde is saying is that puts a lot of responsibility on Black women, or the whichever marginalized group we're talking about, when that work has already been done. It is already out there, it is already in the in the world. And that the people who ask that question, whether they be white feminists, whether they be academics, whether they be politicians, are really good at becoming experts. So why can't they just do the work themselves? So she says, don't spend your time personally educating each person who asks you a question. Teach, or direct them to educate themselves, because the work is out there, and should not be your burden to instruct the oppressors. She ends the piece with, I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives there. So any kind of part of yourself that is different than the people around you, and so that you fear it and loathe it. She says, see whose face it wears. Then as the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all our choice. And I'm curious for you to take a second, reflect on this quote in whether it's your own life or in your own scholarship. What does it bring to mind? What does it mean what does it mean for you? What kind of thoughts does it push to reach into yourself, think about those things that are different in yourself, and then use that as a way to, build a better future? What kind of ideas does that provoke in your mind or in your scholarship? If you're comfortable sharing, please do. You could use the chat, or you could speak up. Okay. So keep thinking through this. I think it's both, emotionally, spiritually powerful to think about, but it's also important to think about in terms of our work that we're all doing, because so many of you in your research are looking at differences and who is setting people apart. And one of the solutions to that might be something like acknowledging differences within communities and finding ways to empower those differences. Okay, shifting gears a little bit, we're going to be talking about decolonizing feminism. And this is a way to expand and in some ways critique the Afrocentric feminism that we just read about. But this is definitely a critique of the previous conceptions of power, specifically Foucault. Okay, Trinh Minh Ha is a Vietnamese scholar. She immigrated to the US when she was 18. She received her PhD at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, so close to home. She now is a professor of both rhetoric and gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley. She is an award-winning filmmaker and is actually very prolific in terms of essays and books and films and cultural critiques, and the list goes on. So I included some of her work here. The first little box is one of her first widely acclaimed films. It's called Surname Viet, Given Name Nam. And it is a reflection on some of her experiences, as well as issues that transcend borders between Vietnam and other countries. Two of her recent books, the first is Elsewhere Within Here. I'm sorry it's so small. The subtitle is Immigration, Refugees, and the Boundary Event. And then her most recent book, which I think came out in 2019 or 2020, is Lovecidal, Walking with the Disappeared, which is a reflection on refugees post 9/11. Okay, so really prolific works. And she really is looking at an international feminism, of thinking about how can we do empowerment on a broad scale, right? So this is how she sets up her argument in this excerpt. First, she says, Western philosophy and metaphysics often presume a dualistic system of thought, meaning in Western societies, we often put boundaries around things and have a two-system, system. So there's me and then there's you. So separate. There's here and there's there. We've separated space. Common in Western thought is thinking of the difference between mind and body. Trying to find some sort of authentic self rather than some kind of false self. A lot of these might sound like, well, what's wrong with that? Because this is how we grew up. It was within the system that we operate, this idea of categorizing, of shoring up boundaries and, dividing them into two camps. So me, you, here, there. And she says, no, identity and, the world doesn't work like that. And it's not unified, or like identity is not unified. I can't ever say I know what I am at one moment, because that might change in the next. It's not fixed and it's poorly defined. And so that creates some problems. So what identity and positionality, and what the self is infinite layers, that there's always something new added on to who you are and to what is. Part of those infinite layers are your connections with the world around you. So you can't say that you are who you are without taking into account all of the people around you, all of your connections, the buildings you live in, the work you go to, right? So there's always this interactional side of your identity. Attempts to define a unique or a special difference is inherently misleading. One of the reasons why she suggests not doing that is because anytime you try to break a category that's been placed, is that the dominant thought in society will instantly try to marginalize you, right? So we see this going on with transgender politics, that an attempt to break out of the binary of gender is really disastrous. And a lot of people are calling them mentally ill, deviant, evil, and so she argues that we actually kind of just need to do away with categories altogether. She gives two examples of this. The first is the attempt to define women. She says that it is a master's tool. So this is going back to Audre Lorde, is a master's tool to try defining categories in the first place. So trying to create some idea of female identity or womanness continues a colonization project. And so she talks about there are many groups who aren't even allowed to be women, right? That when we talk about female empowerment or female politics, we often exclude these groups despite them having a biological gender of female. This is a quote from the excerpt. It is indeed somehow devious to think that woman also encompasses the Chinese with bound feet, the genitally mutilated Africans, and the 1,000 Indians who committed sute for one royal male. So often we exclude groups when we try to define, even when we try to define empowermently. So when we try to say, we are women, we are strong, right? She's saying, you're not including all women. So when you, in your mind, you have this image of who women are, and you exclude these people, what does that mean about those people? So the idea of defining and constructing constructing categories is inherently problematic for Minha. She gives a second example, and this is the third world. So she says, all attempts to try to define some kind of third world fail. So at one point, we defined it economically. So the third world were all of these countries that were underdeveloped, right? Or had We're not industrialized. And then she said, but then you had countries like India that came up, China that came up, and those used to be third countries, no longer third countries. And so then we redefined third world as a political faction of people who are against communism and people who are pro-capitalism. But then you have countries that are super wealthy and are communist and that we work with, and it just gets really complicated, you know? And so she says, all of these ultimately fail. Any kind of categorization ultimately fails. Similarly to Foucault, she says that all of these categorizations both include positive and negative connotations. So they are, third world is often like celebrated as subversive, you know, disrupting the status quo, but they also are described as underprivileged or underdeveloped. And she says, but we need to note how the way that the master's tools are being used is to always be disrupting these positive connotations, this positive subjectivity. And she gives the following example. She says, more recently, we've been hearing of a fourth world. So there's this attempt to kind of describe indigenous folks who are reclaiming religious heritage as fourth world. And she says, again, the colonialist creed, divide and conquer, is here again, alive and well. And notice again how she's pulling from Audre Lorde, this divide and conquer, as part of the master's tool. But what she argues is that celebrating differences is celebrating part of the master's tool, because differences themselves are simply constructed by the master's tool. So she says, often ill at ease with the outspoken, educated natives who represent the third world in debates, and paternalistically scornful of those who remain reserved, the dominant, so the master, thus decides to weaken this term of solidarity, so destroying the term third world, both by invalidating it as an empowering tool and by inciting divisiveness within the third world, making a third world within a third world. So categorization and trying to construct these categories will always be to some extent problematic and repeating a colonial kind of discourse. And she's arguing we need to move beyond that, largely, which will just be fighting for the benefit and like security of all people, rather than focusing on specific positions within society. Oops. So to compare Audre Lorde and Minha, we have Audre Lorde on the left, define and empower, whereas Minha is saying that's itself a master's tool. Audre Lorde is saying differences can spark creativity and empowerment. And Minha is saying categories are weaponized by the dominant groups to sow division, and we need to avoid that completely. Okay, so that is Minha. Let's move on to our last theorist of the week. This is Gayatri Spivak. She was born in India, got her PhD in comparative literature at Cornell. So we've had a cultural critic, a legal scholar, a librarian, a sociologist, and now a comparative literist. She has been a professor all over the US, and she currently is no longer a professor, but teaches illiterate, landless individuals on the border of the West Bengal. Here are a couple of her works, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason, which is where we are reading today. The Post-Colonial Critic, which is interviews with Gayatri Spivak, and one of her more recent one, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. As I said, this is the most difficult reading and difficult to understand. So I actually found a fairly good video, and we are going to watch and listen to this.
Welcome to the MCAT Multimedia Series, a MCAT analysis of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? Post-colonialism is the study of the detritus of empire, the after effects of the colonial era. It looks at the effects that colonialism had on colonized peoples. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak wrote her essay Can the Subaltern Speak? In 1988 to survey the products of what was then a new academic study. She wondered how well post-colonialism had been able to understand and give voice to the colonized, especially the least powerful groups, those she calls subalterns. Her essay criticized much of the work done by mostly white, mostly male Western academics. She pointed out that it is difficult for anyone looking in from outside a colonized group to grant them speech for two reasons. First, because the evidence collected by someone from outside those groups is based on words, not real experience. This, Spivak says, produces logocentric assumptions, inherently restricted or misleading writing built on the study of only one part of the total experience. Secondly, Spivak was wary of intellectuals who attempt to speak for the subalterns rather than allowing them to speak for themselves. She thought this led to them being positioned relative to their colonial rulers rather than allowed a cultural identity of their own. To better understand Spivak's point of view, consider how a natural disaster in a far-off country is reported and understood. A group gathers around a radio to listen to the news. They empathize with those experiencing the disaster and imagine how terrible it must be. They build mental pictures around the reporter's words, but how accurate are these? Without experiencing the disaster themselves, listeners can't fully understand what it's like to be there or grasp much about what life is like before and after the disaster. Spivak believed that Western intellectuals did the same. They intended their response as a positive, affirming act, but actually constrained the group they were writing about by looking almost entirely at their response to one thing: colonial rule. The radio listeners want to help. They raise funds and dispatch charity, but they also share their news on social media, congratulating themselves for doing so. And they define those they try to help merely as disaster victims. Their engagement is on their own terms, not on the terms of the people affected by the disaster. Spivak concluded that while it is possible to recover the voices of the oppressed, it is almost impossible for academics from other countries to recover them wholly or without significant distortion. A more detailed examination of Spivak's ideas can be found in the MCAT analysis.
Okay, hopefully that helped as you try to read. But honestly, if you start reading and you're like, I have no idea what's going on, feel free to move on, watch this video again, and try to get a sense for argument. So let's start by making sure we understand what subaltern means. Subaltern was originally used by Antonio Gramsci, who is an Italian philosopher. Subaltern means those who, for him, are just economically disenfranchised and thus have no voice in politics. Spivak is expanding that to talk about, the people who are just completely disenfranchised from the rest of the world, that have no voice, that have no ability to raise issues to the worldwide community. So this is specifically thinking of indigenous women in non-industrialized countries. So black brown women in, Africa, Asia, South America, etc. That's really who she's focusing on. So she asked two big questions. The first is post-colonial studies that has largely, and she wrote this in 1998, I think was when she published this, or maybe it was 1989. So it's been a while. I do not know if this is still true, but she argues or questions, Is post-colonial studies, which is largely white, male, and from Western countries, able to accurately understand and describe experiences of indigenous and marginalized people, even though they're trying to do something by like addressing the harms of colonialism? She argues, no, they're not capable of doing so because they don't come from that position. That by trying to explain the consequences of colonialism, they're reducing the experiences of these groups and of these people by focusing only on a few dimensions, and it simply marginalizes them further in the world discourse. She asks, can the subaltern speak? Is there any way for them to actually, have a voice that is true to their experiences? And she argues maybe, but we have to find a way to let them speak on their own terms, which is difficult without introducing some kind of categorization, some kind of blocking of their experiences, and so forth. So what are the takeaways from today? I have a couple of prodding questions. So in your work, are you recognizing the interlocking systems of oppression? So the matrix of domination. Are you recognizing how intersections of disadvantage create whole new experiences of disadvantage? So intersectionality. Are you looking to dismantle the master's tools by celebrating differences and their potential for creativity? Or perhaps you're going Minha's route and dismantling the master's tools by avoiding broad categorizations completely. Are you speaking for people rather than allowing them to speak for themselves? So are you letting the subaltern speak? And then some questions to prompt you theoretically, especially as you look at your writing portfolios. How do the various theories of power we've learned about compare and contradict? What are Foucault and Bourdieu missing? What did they have in common with these scholars, and what did these scholars miss? How are they all thinking about resistance and power and their intersections or connections? And then, like, take it to heart. What vision of the future are you hoping for? Which theory or theorist best lines up with your experience, and why not the other ones? Why don't they? And does this mean that they're wrong? So for example, can Audre Lorde and Minha exist in the same place? Can they both have can they both be correct? And how do we make that happen? So those are thoughts I'll leave you with. I'm excited to see how you apply this to your current projects. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will see you next week. Thanks.